The cantina on Kepler Station had survived 3 wars, 2 pirate occupations, and more bar fights than anyone could count. It wasn't pretty. The lights flickered constantly. Smoke from a dozen alien species hung beneath the ceiling like a permanent storm cloud. The air carried the mixed scents of engine fuel, exotic spices, cheap alcohol, and machinery that probably should have been replaced decades ago. Most travelers hated the place, which was exactly why it remained one of the busiest establishments in the sector. Merchants whispered over secret deals. Bounty hunters watched the doors for targets. Mercenaries spent hard-earned credits while pretending not to notice their rivals. In a station filled with dangerous people, everyone understood one simple rule: mind your own business. Especially tonight. Because in the darkest corner of the cantina sat someone even hardened veterans refused to approach. Commander Zathara. Even seated, he looked enormous. If he stood, his head would nearly touch the ceiling. 4 massive arms rested calmly on the reinforced table before him, each one thick enough to bend steel plating. His crystalline purple skin reflected the dim lights in jagged patterns, making him appear carved from living gemstone rather than flesh. But it was the scars that drew attention. Plasma burns crossed his shoulders. Deep blade marks ran down one arm. A jagged crack split part of the crystal armor covering his chest. Every scar carried a story. Every story ended with someone else losing. Veteran soldiers recognized some of them immediately. The scar across his neck came from the siege of Tarsus. The burn on his left shoulder was said to be from a direct starfighter strike. The fractured crystal on his chest had become famous after the Battle of Black Nebula, where Zathara allegedly fought for 6 hours after his armor had already been shattered. Most believed the stories were exaggerated. None were brave enough to ask. The commander's violet eyes glowed softly in the darkness as he sat alone, silently turning a heavy metal cup between his fingers. Around him, conversations remained carefully quiet. Not because anyone feared he would start trouble. Because if trouble appeared, everyone knew exactly who would finish it. Then the cantina doors slid open. A cold draft swept through the room. Several patrons glanced toward the entrance before quickly looking away. Only Zathara kept watching, his glowing eyes narrowed. For the first time that evening, the ancient warrior looked interested, because the figure who had just entered was human. And every instinct Zathara possessed suddenly told him that the most dangerous person on the station had just walked through the door. And when he looked at someone, they felt like he could see right through them. Around him sat 6 young soldiers from different alien species. There was a young Cathari with thick armor plating, a Zalani whose head tentacles twitched nervously, and 4 others who had never seen real combat. They were all new to the Galactic Coalition forces, fresh from training meets on their homeworlds. The recruits had heard stories about Zathara. They said he had fought in every major battle of the Coalition wars. They said he had seen things that would drive lesser beings insane. Most importantly, they said he had fought alongside the humans, and that experience had changed him forever. "Commander," the young Thari said, his voice shaking slightly, "we have heard many things about the humans. Our instructors tell us. They are dangerous, but they look so weak and small. How can creatures with no natural weapons or armor be so feared?" Zathara took a long drink from his cup, a strong liquid that would poison most species, but barely affected his kind. He set the cup down slowly and looked at each of the young faces around him. When he spoke, his voice was deep and rough, like grinding stone. "You want to know about humans?" he said. "You want to know why veterans like me wake up screaming their names in the middle of the night? Very well, I will tell you, but understand this. Once you know what I know, you will never look at the universe the same way again." He leaned back in his chair, and the metal creaked under his weight. The cantina noise seemed to fade away, as everyone nearby sensed that something important was about to be shared. It was 7 years ago during the Battle of Riel 7. The Hegemony had taken control of the mining colonies there, and we needed those resources to keep fighting the war. The planet was mostly rock and crystal caves, perfect for defensive positions. Command said it would be a simple operation. Go in, clear out the enemy, secure the mines. Sethkar's 4 hands moved as he spoke, sketching invisible maps in the air. The young soldiers leaned forward, hanging on every word. I was leading the 3rd Assault Battalion. Then we had 200 of the finest Vorthak warriors, plus support units from 5 other species. We thought we were unstoppable. The enemy had maybe half our numbers, and they were trapped in those caves with nowhere to run. He paused and took another drink. Then Command told us we would have human support. A single unit. They said, 150 humans from something called the 82nd Airborne Division. We laughed. What could these soft little creatures do that we could not? The Zilani recruit made a soft whistling sound, which was how his species showed curiosity. What did they look like, Commander? The humans. Small, Zia said immediately. Much smaller than us. The tallest was barely 6 feet. They had only 2 arms, no natural armor, no claws, no telepathic abilities. Their skin was so thin you could see blood vessels underneath. They looked like they would break if you touched them too hard. He gestured with his lower arms, while his upper hands continued holding his drink. Their leader was called Colonel Jake Morrison, a human male with gray hair and eyes like ice. When he came to our briefing, he was so quiet that half the commanders forgot he was there. He did not boast about his unit's abilities. He did not make grand speeches about victory and honor like we do. He just sat there listening and taking notes on a small device. The young Cathari shifted his armored plates nervously. What about their weapons, Commander? Were they advanced? Zathara made a sound that might have been laughter, but there was no humor in it. This was the strangest thing. While we prepared our plasma rifles and energy shields, the humans spent hours checking old-style kinetic weapons, projectile launchers that fired metal bullets, chemical explosives that needed to be armed by hand, equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. He held up one of his 4 hands, counting on his fingers. They had something called rifles, which shot small pieces of metal very fast. They had grenades, which were small bombs they could throw. They had knives, actual metal blades that they attached to their rifles, and they had heavy weapons that fired hundreds of bullets per minute. The recruits exchanged glances. This did not sound very impressive compared to the advanced energy weapons used by other coalition species. But here is what we noticed during that first briefing. Zeltha continued. Every human soldier checked every piece of equipment at least 3 times. They took apart their weapons and put them back together. They counted their ammunition. They tested their communication devices. They did this over and over until it was perfect. He leaned forward, his glowing eyes fixed on the young faces around him. We thought this meant they did not trust their equipment. We were wrong. They were preparing for something we did not understand. The cantina had grown quieter around them. Other patrons, many of them veterans themselves, had stopped their own conversations to listen. Stories about humans were always popular among soldiers, though few would admit it. The night before the assault, I walked through their camp. Zakara said, I wanted to see what these famous humans were really like. What I found confused me more than anything I had ever seen. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. They were sitting around small fires talking quietly. Some were writing letters on paper, actual paper, not digital messages. Others were looking at small pictures of what I learned were their families back on Earth. A few were singing together, sad songs about home and loss. The Zilani recruit's tentacles curled with confusion. This sounds normal, Commander. All soldiers think of home before battle. Yes, Seth Carrara agreed. But listen to what else they were doing. Some humans were sharpening their metal knives until they could cut through steel. Others were modifying their ammunition, changing the bullets in ways that would make them more deadly. A few were mixing chemicals to make their explosives more powerful. His voice dropped lower, and they talked about death as if it was an old friend, not with fear or sadness, but with a strange kind of acceptance. They made jokes about dying. They planned what to do if their friends were killed. They discussed how to keep fighting, even if they were badly wounded. The young soldiers around the table grew very quiet. This was not how their species prepared for battle. Colonel Morrison found me watching his soldiers. Zathara continued. He walked over and stood next to me, this small human barely reaching my chest. For a long time, we just watched his people prepare. Then he said something I will never forget. Zathar's 4 hands clenched into fists as he remembered. He said, Commander, tomorrow your people will fight to win. My people will fight to make sure the enemy never wants to fight again. At the time, I thought he was just making empty threats. I had no idea what those words really meant. The old veteran finished his drink and set the empty container on the table with a heavy thud. The assault was scheduled to begin at dawn. We expected to be done by midday. The hegemony forces were trapped, outnumbered, and cut off from supplies. It should have been simple. He looked at each of the young faces around him, his scarred features grim in the dim light. None of us, not the coalition commanders, not the intelligence officers, not even the humans themselves, knew that this battle would change everything. It was the first time most of us had seen humans in real combat. Zathara stood up slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the table. What happened next will haunt me until the day I die. And after I tell you this story, it will haunt you too. Commander Zathara sat back down in his chair, the metal groaning under his weight. The young recruits around the table waited quietly, their eyes fixed on the old veteran. The cantina had grown even quieter, with other patrons straining to hear the famous commander story about humans. Dawn came too quickly. Szeth Karara began, his voice rough with memory. The attack started exactly as planned. My Vorak warriors moved forward with the other coalition forces. We had plasma rifles that could melt through steel, energy shields that could stop most weapons, and centuries of military tradition behind us. He raised one of his forehands, pointing toward the ceiling, as if he could still see the battle playing out above them. The first wave hit the hegemony positions at exactly 600 hours. We expected to break through their defenses within minutes. After all, we had superior numbers, better technology, and the element of surprise. The young Thari leaned forward, his armor plates clicking softly. What happened, Commander? Did the attack succeed? Szeth Kar made that sound that might have been laughter again, but it was bitter and cold. We were slaughtered. The hegemony had turned those crystal caves into a death trap. They had energy weapons hidden in the walls, force fields that channeled us into kill zones, and defensive positions that made our plasma rifles useless. His violet eyes grew distant as he remembered. Within the first hour, we lost 60% of our assault force. The Zelani telepaths could not penetrate the crystal formations to locate enemy positions. The Cathari heavy armor was useless against weapons that fired from every direction. My own warriors, the proud Vorthok, were cut down like grass before a harvester. The recruits exchanged worried glances. They had heard that the coalition forces were nearly invincible, but this story painted a very different picture. The retreat order came after 2 hours of fighting. The Thara continued. What was left of our forces pulled back to the landing zone. We had failed completely. The hegemony forces were probably laughing at us from their crystal caves. He paused to signal for another drink from the cantina server, a small creature with too many eyes, who skewered between tables. But the humans had not moved yet. Colonel Morrison kept his forces in reserve during our attack. We thought they were cowards, afraid to fight alongside real warriors. The drink arrived, and Zathara took a long sip before continuing. Morrison came to our command post about an hour after the retreat. He was still clean, no dust or blood on his uniform. The other commanders were angry, demanding to know why his humans had not supported the attack. Zathara's 4 hands moved as he spoke, recreating the scene. Morrison just stood there looking at our tactical displays and casualty reports. Then he said something that made everyone in the command post stop talking. He said, "You fought their battle, now we fight ours." The Zelani recruit's tentacles curled with confusion. What did he mean? Commander, how could there be a different battle? That is exactly what we asked him, Szeth. Karara replied. Morrison walked over to the tactical display and pointed at the crystal caves where the hegemony forces were hiding. He said, "You tried to break down their front door. We are going to burn down their house." The old veteran's expression grew more serious. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about warfare. Morrison called for his unit leaders, and they gathered around the tactical display. But instead of planning a direct assault like we had done, they started talking about things that made no sense to us. He counted on his fingers as he spoke. They talked about supply lines and communication networks. They discussed something called psychological warfare. They planned to attack places that were not even defended. It was like they were fighting a completely different war than the rest of us. Szeth Kara took another drink, his hands steady despite the weight of his memories. The humans moved out at sunset, but they did not head toward the crystal caves where the enemy was waiting. Instead, they split into small groups and disappeared into the rocky terrain around the mining complex. The young soldiers around the table leaned closer. This was not how they had been taught warfare worked. For the first night, nothing happened. Szeth Karara continued. We sat in our command post, watching our sensors and waiting for reports. The hegemony forces were still in their caves, probably wondering why we had not attacked again. His voice dropped lower, and the recruits had to strain to hear him. Then, just before dawn, Lieutenant Amy Foster and her squad did something that should have been impossible. They infiltrated the Hegemony supply depot, which was supposed to be heavily guarded. Z8 Car's 4 hands clenched into fists, but they did not use advanced weapons or special equipment. Foster's team used medical supplies from their first aid kits and food from their emergency rations. They mixed these common items together and created explosives that were more powerful than our military grenades. The Cathari recruits' armor plates shifted nervously. How could medical supplies become weapons, Commander? That is what we ask ourselves, Zakara replied. We learned later that humans study chemistry as part of their basic education. They know how different substances react with each other. What we saw as medical supplies and food, they saw as raw materials for weapons. He gestured with his upper hands, while his lower hands remained on the table. The explosion at the supply depot was just the beginning. While we were still trying to understand what had happened, Sergeant Ron Blake was leading another team to attack the Hegemony Communication Center. The Thara's eyes glowed brighter as he remembered. Blake's team did not have special equipment for breaking through the Sense defenses. Instead, they used construction tools from the mining complex. They turned digging machines into weapons, welding equipment into cutting tools, and transport vehicles into mobile attack platforms. The young soldiers around the table looked at each other with growing amazement and fear. This was not the kind of warfare they had learned about in their training. But the most disturbing thing was still to come. Seth Carrara continued. Private Danny Martinez was part of a reconnaissance team that got caught in a hegemony patrol. He took a direct hit from a plasma rifle, the kind of wound that would kill any of us instantly. The veteran's voice became very quiet. Martinez should have died immediately. The plasma burn went through his chest armor and into his lung. Any rational being would have collapsed and waited for medical assistance. But Martinez kept fighting. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. For 3 more hours, Martinez continued his mission. He was bleeding, struggling to breathe, and obviously in terrible pain. But he kept moving, kept fighting, kept completing his objectives. When our medical teams finally reached him, they could not believe he was still alive. The Zelani recruit made a soft whistling sound of distress. How is that possible, Commander? How can a being fight with such injuries? That is what we asked the human medics, Seth Carrara replied. They explained that humans have something called adrenaline, a chemical their bodies produce during extreme stress. This chemical allows them to ignore pain, fight through injuries that would other species, and continue functioning long after they should be dead. He took another drink, his hands shaking slightly now. But it was not just the adrenaline. Martinez kept fighting because his team needed him to complete the mission. He was not fighting for glory, or honor, or even survival. He was fighting because other humans were counting on him. The cantina had grown completely silent around them. Even the servers had stopped moving, listening to the story that was being told. By the end of the second day, the Hegemony forces were in chaos. Zathara continued. Their supplies were destroyed, their communications were cut, and their defensive positions were being attacked from directions they had never considered. His 4 hands moved in complex patterns as he described the battle. Colonel Morrison's strategy was working perfectly. The humans were not trying to defeat the enemy in direct combat. They were making it impossible for the enemy to fight at all. Zathara looked directly at each of the young recruits, and that was when I realized something that terrified me more than any weapon or enemy I had ever faced. The humans were not just fighting to win this battle. They were fighting to make sure the Hegemony would never want to fight humans again. The old veteran finished his second drink and set the container down with a heavy thud. What I saw in the next 2 days changed everything I thought I knew about warfare, about courage, and about what it means to be a soldier. The humans showed us that there are things far more dangerous than superior technology or overwhelming numbers. He stood up slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows in the dim light. They showed us that the most dangerous weapon in the universe is a human who refuses to give up. Commander Zathara remained standing for a moment, his forearms hanging at his sides as he stared into the distance. The young recruits waited patiently, knowing that the old veteran was gathering his thoughts for the next part of his story. Around them, the cantina had grown so quiet that they could hear the hum of the station's life support systems. After the Battle of Riel 7 ended, Zatha finally said, sitting back down heavily, I knew I had to understand what made humans so different. Command assigned me to work directly with human units for the next 2 years. They said it was an honor, a chance to learn from the galaxy's newest military experts. He signaled for another drink, his third of the evening. I thought it would be simple: study their tactics, learn their strategies, and apply their methods to our own forces. I was wrong. What I discovered was far more disturbing than anything I had seen on the battlefield. The young Kari shifted his armored plates, creating soft clicking sounds. What did you learn, Commander? What made the humans so effective? Zara accepted his drink from the server and took a long sip before answering. I learned that human warfare is not about weapons or tactics or technology. It is about something much more frightening. It is about the human mind and how they think about death, sacrifice, and what they call duty. His violet eyes focused on each recruit in turn. My first assignment was at the siege of Alter Station. The HFY had taken control of a major supply hub, and we needed to get it back. The station was built into an asteroid with only a few ways to get inside. The enemy had thousands of troops, heavy weapons, and months of supplies. Zathara used his 4 hands to sketch the layout in the air. Coalition Command sent Captain Lisa Rodriguez with 40 human Marines to help with the assault. 40 Marines against thousands of enemies. We thought it was a joke or perhaps a punishment for some failure we had not heard about. The Zilani recruit's tentacles curled with curiosity. How could 40 soldiers make a difference against such numbers, Commander? That is exactly what I asked Captain Rodriguez when she arrived, Zathara replied. Rodriguez was a small human female, barely 5.5 feet tall. She had brown hair, dark eyes, and scars on her hands from previous battles. When I questioned her about her impossible mission, she just smiled and said something I will never forget. He paused, his expression growing darker. She said, "Commander, you are thinking about this wrong. We are not here to fight thousands of enemies. We are here to make thousands of enemies afraid to fight us." At the time, I thought she was speaking. Nonsense. Zakara took another drink, his hands steady despite the weight of his memories. The siege began 3 days later. Coalition forces attacked the main entrances to the station, trying to break through the enemy defenses. For the first week, we made no progress. The HFY had turned every corridor into a killing zone. His voice dropped lower, but Rodriguez and her Marines did not attack the main defenses. Instead, they found maintenance tunnels that led into the asteroid's core. These tunnels were narrow, dangerous, and filled with radiation from the station's power systems. The old veteran's 4 hands clenched into fists. Any normal being would have died within hours in those tunnels. The radiation alone should have been fatal. But the humans had something they called radiation suits. Simple protective clothing that allowed them to survive in environments that would kill other species. He gestured with his upper hands while his lower hands remained on the table. For 18 days, Rodriguez and her Marines lived in those tunnels. They had no contact with the outside forces, no supply lines, and no way to retreat if things went wrong. They were completely cut off, surrounded by enemies. The recruits leaned forward, fascinated and horrified by the story. What we learned later was that the humans were not just hiding in those tunnels, Zathara continued. They were systematically destroying the station's infrastructure. They cut power lines, sabotaged life support systems, and planted explosives in critical locations. His voice became quieter, forcing the young soldiers to strain to hear him. But the most disturbing thing was how they handled the psychological pressure. Living in those tunnels should have driven them insane. The radiation, the isolation, the constant danger. Any of our species would have broken within days. Zathara looked directly at the Cathari recruit. Corporal Kevin Wright was injured on the 5th day. A piece of shrapnel from an explosion broke both of his legs. He could not walk, could barely crawl, and was in constant pain. Any rational being would have asked to be evacuated. The veteran's eyes glowed brighter as he remembered. Instead, Wright continued his mission. He crawled through the ventilation systems for 13 more days, dragging himself from one objective to the next, and the entire time he was singing. Zilani recruit made a soft whistling sound of confusion. Singing Commander. Why would he sing? That is what I asked the other humans when I heard the recordings from their communication systems, Zathara replied. They explained that Wright was singing something called country music, songs from his home region on Earth. The other Marines could hear him through their radio systems, and it helped them stay calm. He shook his head slowly. I listened to those recordings later. Wright was crawling through deadly tunnels, fighting through pain that would kill most beings, completing impossible missions. and he was singing about farms and dogs and old trucks. It made no sense to me. Seth Carrara took another drink, his expression growing more troubled. On the 16th day, Wright reached his final objective. He had to plant charges in the station's main power core, a task that required him to crawl through a shaft filled with deadly energy discharges. The cantina around them had grown completely silent. Even the servers had stopped their work, listening to the story with the same fascination as the recruits. The explosion Wright created knocked out power to half the station. Seth Kara continued, but the energy discharge should have killed him instantly. When our forces finally reached that location 2 days later, they found Wright unconscious, but alive, still humming one of his songs. He looked at each of the young faces around the table. The medic said he should have died from radiation poisoning, energy burns, blood loss, and shock. But Wright survived because he refused to die before completing his mission. The old veteran's forehands moved in complex patterns as he spoke. That was when I began to understand something terrible about human psychology. They do not just fight for victory, or survival, or even honor. They fight because they have made promises to each other, and they would rather die than break those promises. Zathara's voice became very quiet. Captain Rodriguez explained it to me after the siege ended. She said that humans form what they call bonds with their fellow soldiers. These bonds are stronger than fear, stronger than pain, stronger than the desire to survive. The young Cathari's armor plates shifted nervously. How is that possible, Commander? How can emotional connections be stronger than survival instincts? That is the question that haunted me for months. Zathara replied, I studied human military records, interviewed their officers, and observed their training methods. What I learned changed everything I thought I knew about warfare and courage. He finished his drink and set the container down with a heavy thud. Humans train differently than other species. We train to fight and win. They train to fight and die for each other. They practice scenarios where they must choose between their own survival and the survival of their comrades. Zanusser's expression grew darker, and in every single training exercise, every simulation, every test scenario, humans consistently choose to sacrifice themselves for their fellow soldiers. It is not just military doctrine for them, it is who they are. The recruits exchanged worried glances. This was not the kind of enemy they had been prepared to face in their own training. The most chilling part, Seth Carrara continued, is that humans do not see this as heroic or unusual. They call it duty, as if dying for strangers is the most natural thing in the universe. They write letters to families they may never see again, make jokes about their own deaths, and plan their own memorial services. He stood up slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the table. After the siege of Alter Station, I thought I understood human warfare. I was wrong again. What I had seen was only the beginning. The humans were still learning, still adapting, still finding new ways to turn impossible situations into victories. Seth Carrara looked down at the young recruits, his scarred features grim in the dim light. The next campaign would show me that human warfare is not just about individual courage or sacrifice. It is about something far more dangerous, their ability to change the very nature of war itself. The old veteran began to walk away from the table, then stopped and looked back at the recruits. What I am about to tell you next will explain why every species in the galaxy now fears the humans, even those who call them allies. Because once humans decide that war is necessary, they do not just fight to win. They fight to make sure the enemy never wants to fight anyone ever again. Commander Zathara walked back to the table slowly, his forearms moving in rhythm with his heavy steps. The young recruits had not moved during his brief absence, their eyes still fixed on the spot where he had been standing. The weight of his previous words hung in the air, like smoke from a burning world. The campaign of the Shattered Worlds, Zathara said as he sat back down, began 2 years after Alter Station. By then, the High Hegemony had learned to fear human tactics. They stopped using fixed defensive positions and began targeting civilian populations instead. He signaled for another drink, his fourth of the evening, but his hands remained steady. The hegemony leaders thought they understood human psychology. They believed that if they threatened innocent lives, the humans would be forced to negotiate. They could not have been more wrong. The young Kari leaned forward, his armor plates clicking softly. What happened, Commander? How did the humans respond to attacks on civilians? Zathara's violet eyes grew darker, reflecting memories that still haunted him. Major Rick Stevens arrived with the 101st Combined Arms Division. Stevens was different from the other human officers I had met. He was quiet, thoughtful, and seemed to carry a great weight on his shoulders. The old veteran accepted his drink from the server and took a small sip before continuing. The first civilian colony was destroyed while we were still planning our response. 50,000 beings, mostly farmers and their families, killed in a single orbital bombardment. The HFY broadcast the attack across all communication channels, demanding that coalition forces surrender, his four hands clenched into fists on the table. I expected the humans to be angry, maybe even reckless in their desire for revenge. Instead, Stevens gathered his officers and spent 3 days in complete silence, studying star charts and supply manifests. The Zilani recruits' tentacles curled with confusion. Why did they study supply charts, Commander? Should they not have been planning an immediate counterattack? That is what I asked Stevens when he finally emerged from his planning sessions. Zathara replied. Stevens looked at me with eyes that seemed much older than his actual age, and he said something that chilled me to my core. Sakara paused, taking another sip of his drink. Stevens said, Commander, the enemy has just taught us that this war has no rules. They want to fight without honor, without mercy, without limits. Very well. We will give them exactly what they asked for. The cantina around them had grown quiet again, with other patrons straining to hear the continuation of the famous story. What Stevens did next changed the entire nature of galactic warfare. Zathara continued. Instead of attacking hegemony military targets, he began systematically dismantling their entire civilization. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The humans had been studying hegemony society for months, learning about their culture, their economy, their social structures. Stevens used this knowledge to create what he called a campaign of total war. The old veteran's forehands moved as he spoke, sketching invisible battle plans in the air. Commander Helen Brooks led the first strike team to the HFY agricultural worlds, but instead of destroying the farms, her forces captured them intact and began shipping food to coalition refugee camps. He looked directly at the young recruits. The HFY forces had to choose between protecting their food supplies and defending their military bases. Every choice they made cost them something they could not afford to lose. Zathara took another drink, his expression growing more troubled. But the most disturbing operation was led by Captain Bill Turner. His unit infiltrated hegemony communication networks and began broadcasting something the humans called psychological warfare. The Cathari recruits' armor plates shifted nervously. What kind of broadcasts, Commander? Turner's broadcasts were recordings of hegemony soldiers talking about their doubts, their fears, their desire to go home, Zetha replied. The humans had intercepted private communications and were playing them back to enemy forces across multiple star systems. His voice became quieter, forcing the recruits to lean closer. But that was not the worst part. The humans also broadcast recordings of hegemony civilians crying for help during the colony attacks. They made sure every enemy soldier heard the voices of the innocent beings their own government had murdered. Seth Carrara's forehands trembled slightly as he remembered. Within weeks, hegemony forces began surrendering without fighting, not because they were defeated, but because they could no longer believe in their cause. The young soldiers around the table exchanged worried glances. This was psychological warfare on a scale they had never imagined. Then came the Battle of New Carthage. Zathara continued, his voice growing even quieter. The hegemony made one final attempt to break human morale. They captured a coalition transport carrying civilian refugees and threatened to execute them unless all human forces withdrew from 3 star systems. He finished his drink in one long swallow and set the empty container down with shaking hands. Commander Helen Brooks was leading the joint task force assigned to rescue those refugees. The transport was heavily defended, surrounded by hegemony warships, and rigged with explosives that could be detonated at the first sign of rescue attempt. The old veteran's eyes grew distant as he relived the memory. Brooks had 2 choices. She could withdraw her forces and save 3 star systems, or she could attempt a rescue that would probably fail and result in the deaths of everyone she was trying to save. Seth Kara looked at each of the young faces around the table. I was on the bridge of Brooks's flagship when she made her decision. She studied the tactical displays for exactly 30 seconds, then gave orders that I still do not fully understand. His 4 hands moved in complex patterns as he described the scene. Brooks ordered her entire fleet to jump directly into the middle of the hegemony formation. Not around it, not behind it, but right into the center, where the transport was being held. The Zilani recruit made a soft whistling sound of amazement. That should have been suicide, Commander. How could they survive jumping into the middle of enemy forces? They could not, Zathara replied simply. Brooks knew her fleet would be destroyed. She knew most of her crew would die. She knew the rescue mission would probably fail. But she also knew something else. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Brooks knew that if the humans retreated even once in the face of threats against civilians, the HFY would never stop making those threats. So she chose to make sure the enemy learned that threatening innocents would only make humans more dangerous. Zethakara's voice became very quiet. The battle lasted exactly 47 minutes. Brooks lost 60% of her fleet, including her own flagship, but she saved every single refugee on that transport. The recruit sat in stunned silence trying to process what they had heard. After the explosion that destroyed her ship, rescue teams found Brooks floating in space. Badly, injured, but still alive, Zathara continued. When they brought her aboard the medical ship, the first thing she asked was not about her own condition or the status of her crew. His violet eyes glowed brighter in the dim light. Brooks asked if the HFY commanders had received the message. She had recorded before the battle a message explaining that any future attacks on civilians would result in the complete destruction of hegemony civilization. The old veteran stood up slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the table. That message was broadcast across the entire galaxy. Every species, every government, every military force heard Brooks' promise that humans would respond to attacks on innocents with total warfare. He looked down at the young recruits, his scarred features grim. The HFY never attacked another civilian target, not because they lacked the ability, but because they finally understood what they were fighting against. Seth Carrara began to walk away from the table again, then stopped and looked back. Brooke survived her injuries and returned to duty 3 months later. When I asked her how she could make such terrible decisions so quickly, she gave me an answer that haunts me to this day. The cantina had grown completely silent around them. Even the background hum of the station systems seemed muted. Brooke said, "Commander, humans do not calculate the cost of doing what is right. We calculate the cost of not doing it." Then she walked away, leaving me to understand that human warfare is not about winning or losing. Zathura's 4 hands clenched into fists. It is about making sure that evil actions have consequences so terrible that no one will ever want to repeat them. The old veteran looked at each of the young faces one final time, and that is why every species in the galaxy now fears the humans, even those who call them friends. Because once humans decide that something is wrong, they will sacrifice everything to make it right. Commander Ethkar returned to his seat one final time, moving more slowly than before. The weight of his memory seemed to press down on his massive frame, making even his great strength appear diminished. The young recruits waited in respectful silence, knowing that the conclusion of his story would be the most important part. The war ended 6 months after the Battle of New Carthage. Zithgara began, his voice quieter than it had been all evening. Not with a great final battle, or a desperate last stand. The HFY leadership simply sent a message to Coalition headquarters, requesting immediate surrender negotiations. He gestured with his upper hands, while his lower hands remained still on the table. I was present during those negotiations as a military observer. The hegemony delegates were some of the proudest beings in the galaxy, rulers of an empire that had controlled hundreds of worlds for thousands of years. The old veteran's violet eyes grew distant as he remembered, but when they sat across from the human negotiators, these proud leaders could not hide their fear. They spoke in whispers, avoided eye contact, and agreed to every single demand without argument. The young Kari shifted his armor plates, the sound echoing in the quiet cantina. What were they afraid of, Commander? The humans had won, but surely the war was over. Zathara made that sound that might have been laughter, but it held no humor. That is exactly what I asked General Patricia Coleman when the negotiations ended. Coleman had been promoted to head of Coalition Joint Operations after Brooks's sacrifice, and she was the most senior human officer in the galaxy. He paused to order another drink, his 5th of the evening, though his hands remained steady. Coleman was a small woman, even by human standards. She had gray hair, kind eyes, and spoke so softly that you had to lean close to hear her. She looked like someone's grandmother, not a military commander. The Zilani recruit's tentacles curled with curiosity. "What did she tell you, Commander?" Coleman walked with me to the observation deck overlooking the negotiation chamber. Zakara continued. She pointed at the hegemony delegates and said something that changed my understanding of everything that had happened during the war. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Coleman said, "Commander, they are not afraid of what we did to them. They are afraid of what we might become if we have to fight them again." The recruits leaned forward, straining to hear every word. I asked Coleman to explain what she meant. Seth Kara said, she was quiet for a long time, watching the hegemony leaders through the transparent wall. Then she told me something that I think about every single day. He accepted his drink from the server and took a small sip before continuing. Coleman said that humans had learned something terrible about themselves during the war. They had discovered that there was no limit to what they would do to protect innocent beings from harm. Seth Carr's forehands moved slowly as he spoke. She explained that every human military unit now carried detailed plans for something they called escalation protocols. If an enemy used certain tactics, humans would respond with increasingly severe measures until the enemy stopped. The old veteran's expression grew darker, but the most chilling part was that these protocols had no upper limit. If an enemy continued to harm civilians, humans would continue to escalate their response until either the enemy surrendered or their entire civilization was destroyed. The young soldiers around the table exchanged worried glances. This was a level of warfare that their training had never prepared them for. Coleman showed me some of these protocols. Seth Kara continued, his voice growing quieter. They were written in simple language like a cookbook or instruction manual. Step 1. Disable enemy military forces. Step 2. Destroy enemy infrastructure. Step 3. Eliminate enemy leadership, and so on. He took another sip of his drink, his hands trembling slightly now. The final steps in these protocols were things that I hope never to see implemented. Complete destruction of enemy worlds, systematic elimination of their entire species, even the eradication of all records that they had ever existed. The Cathari recruits' armor plates clattered nervously. Surely these were just threats, Commander. No civilized being would actually implement such measures. Seth Carrara looked directly at the young soldier. That is what I told myself, until Coleman explained that these protocols were not threats or psychological warfare. They were operational plans that human commanders were prepared to implement if necessary. The cantina around them had grown so quiet that the only sound was the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Coleman told me that the hegemony leaders had studied these protocols during the surrender negotiations. Zathara continued. They realized that humans were not just capable of total warfare. They were prepared for it, trained for it, and willing to accept the psychological cost of implementing it. His four hands clenched into fists on the table. But the most terrifying revelation was still to come. Coleman explained that humans had already begun developing new warfare methods, learning from their experiences during the conflict. Zethkar's voice became very quiet. She said that human militaries were now teaching courses on something called adaptive warfare, not just responding to enemy tactics, but predicting what enemies might do and preparing countermeasures before those tactics were even used. The old veteran stood up slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows in the dim light. 3 years have passed since the war ended. In that time, I have served as a liaison officer between human forces and other coalition species. What I have learned during these years terrifies me more than anything I saw during the actual fighting. He began to pace behind his chair, his forearms moving in complex patterns. Human military thinking has evolved beyond anything we thought possible. They now study the psychology, culture, and social structures of every known species in the galaxy. The recruits watched him pace, hanging on every word. Not just enemy species, Zatha continued. Allied species as well. The humans have detailed plans for how to fight against every single member of the coalition, including species that have been their closest friends and supporters. The Zalani recruit made a soft whistling sound of distress. Why would they plan to fight their own allies? Commander Seth Carrara stopped pacing and looked directly at the young soldier. Because humans have learned that alliances can change, that friends can become enemies, and that the best way to preserve peace is to be prepared for any possible conflict. He returned to his seat, moving more slowly than before. I have seen human training exercises where they practice fighting against Varak battle tactics, Cathari defensive formations, and Zalani telepathic warfare. They study our weaknesses, our blind spots, our cultural tabos. The old veteran's voice became barely audible, and they are very, very good at finding ways to defeat us. Zithkara finished his drink in one long swallow and set the empty container down with finality. 6 months ago, I was invited to observe a human war college graduation ceremony. 200 human officers received their commissions, and each one delivered a presentation on theoretical warfare scenarios. His violet eyes glowed dimly in the candlelight. One young human lieutenant presented a plan for defeating a Vorok rebellion using only non-lethal weapons and psychological pressure. Another described how to neutralize Cathari armor advantages using simple environmental modifications. The recruits sat in stunned silence, realizing the implications of what they were hearing. But the presentation that haunts me the most was given by a human captain named Sandra White. Zathara continued. White presented a complete strategy for ending galactic civilization as we know it, should it ever become necessary to protect human values and ideals. He looked at each of the young faces around the table. White's plan was thorough, practical, and absolutely terrifying. She had calculated exactly how to disable every major government, every military force, every economic system in known space. The old veteran stood up one final time, his scarred features grim in the dim light. When I asked White why she had developed such a plan, she gave me the same answer that Coleman had given years earlier. Zakara's 4 hands clenched into fists. White said that humans do not create these plans because they want to use them. They create them because they never want to be in a situation where they need something that does not exist. He began to walk away from the table, then stopped and looked back at the recruits. That is why every species in the galaxy fears the humans, even those who call them friends. Not because of what humans have done, but because of what they are prepared to do. The cantina remained silent as the Thara walked toward the exit. Just before he reached the door, he turned back one final time. The humans call themselves the protectors of peace, he said quietly, and they are. But they have made themselves capable of destroying everything they protect should it ever become necessary. The old veteran looked at the young recruits with eyes that had seen too much. Sleep well tonight, knowing that human soldiers stand guard over our civilization. But remember this, they are not guarding us from external threats alone.